your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hello, thanks for joining us for a look at what's been making headlines in Alberta. It's been a deadly couple of weeks for Albertans visiting the Rocky Mountains. With all the fresh snowfall lately, it's been tempting for outdoor winter enthusiasts to hit the slopes and trails of the backcountry. Officials at Avalanche Canada, however, say that we need to use caution. This past week, they extended a special avalanche warning due to a significant snowfall on top of the snowpack layer that's been causing concern. Tyson Reddy of Avalanche Canada says as much as 60 centimeters fell in the Southern Rockies recently, particularly in the Fernie, BC area, and the warning extends into Banff National Park for this weekend.
For the areas where we are still seeing high avalanche danger on the map, the message to avoid avalanche terrain altogether continues. And that's more or less the advice anytime you see high avalanche danger on the map is to avoid avalanche terrain. We've got quite a few areas on the map now that have the considerable danger rating, and the message there is slightly different. It's about choosing conservative, low consequence terrain. So if you are riding steep slopes or traveling underneath steep slopes, if you're hiking, that type of thing, it's looking for low consequence slopes. Slopes only they're only capable of producing small avalanches with a favorable run out. So no terrain trapped below cliffs, creeks, that type of thing.
Last weekend, another Albertan was caught in an avalanche and died in the Revelstoke region while snowbiking. This follows the previous weekend's deadly avalanche in southern Alberta's Castle Wildlife Provincial Park that claimed the life of 46-year-old Lethbridge dentist Scott Wahlberger while he was snowmobiling. He leaves behind a wife and 3 children in McGrath. And according to Reddy, contrary to popular belief, the sound from a snowmobile has no bearing on what might have triggered that avalanche.
The noise produced by snowmobiles actually isn't capable of triggering avalanches. Sound, period, actually can't trigger avalanches. However, that's a very common misconception. I often tell people that the avalanche doesn't care about your mode of travel.
He adds that anyone heading out into the backcountry should be aware of the avalanche risk and check online resources. He also says being trained through an avalanche skills training course could help save your life one day. Good advice. Well, Lethbridge police have charged the parents of an infant girl with assault. They say on November 27th of last year, Child and Family Services requested help from police after receiving a report about a 3-week-old baby whose arm had been broken as a result of significant force. The child was taken by the agency at Chinook Regional Hospital and is no longer in the care of the parents. A 33-year-old woman and 39-year-old man were arrested and faced charges, including aggravated assault of the infant. No names are being released due to protect the identity of the child. The 2 adults were scheduled to appear in court this week to answer to the charges. Lethbridge police are warning parents and caregivers to be aware of violent online groups which have been targeting children. They say earlier this year they received information that through online chats, these groups are grooming young people, manipulating them to participate in self-harm, send sexually explicit images, and to even act out violently against others. Sergeant Carrie Shima with Alerts ICE Division says these predators are targeting vulnerable youth.
A vulnerable youth in our realm isn't necessarily a child who is constantly vulnerable. It may be a day, it may be a moment, it may be a week, it may be a month, but they're targeting as many kids as possible to get them to send sexualized images, to self-harm, and in some cases harm others or even commit suicide. So these groups here are motivated by ideology and are targeting youth who are vulnerable. So being able to communicate with your kids and being able to identify some of those signs is really important when it comes to them maybe having a bad day or a bad moment or a bad week, something like that. So what we're looking for when we're talking about sextortion or self-harm are things like, especially withdrawing from the family or from their friends is a very big sign. Drastic changes in behavior, changes in the way they dress, purposefully covering up easy to injure areas. So when I'm talking about self-harm, we're talking about hands, arms, wrists, legs, extremities, things like that. So if we're covering things up unusually or wearing clothes that may not be appropriate for the weather or the conditions outside in order in order to cover up things like that.
Sergeant Shima says more information on red flags to watch out for when it comes to these predators can be found on the Alert website. Still to come, a class action lawsuit is launched against the government for misinformation and negligence around COVID-19 vaccines. More after the break. The 28-year-old man who fired shots and tossed a Molotov cocktail in Edmonton City Hall in January appeared in court on Tuesday for terrorism charges. Bazari Sarver was initially charged with 6 weapons offenses following the incident in January. Bazarni Sarver was initially charged with 6 weapons offenses following the incident in January. He is now facing additional charges of counseling commission of a terrorism offense and possession of property for terrorist purposes. Fortunately, no one was injured during the incident. Edmonton police say the attack was politically motivated.
Our investigation ultimately determined that the actions of Mr. Sarvar were believed to be politically motivated and therefore reached the legal threshold required to support the terrorism charges which were ultimately laid. Among the items seized at the scene were an SKS assault-style rifle, 3 prohibited rifle magazines, approximately 150 rounds of ammunition, and 4 gasoline-filled Molotov cocktails. This certainly highlights the risk posed to the public and the amount of damage that could have been done that day. Throughout our investigation, our investigative team was in regular communication with Public Prosecution Service of Canada, or PPSC, who ultimately consented to the laying of terrorism and related offenses.
A class action lawsuit has been launched against both the federal and provincial governments alleging misinformation and negligence about the risks and dangers associated with the COVID-19 vaccines. The lawsuit has been filed by Rath & Company in Edmonton on behalf of Albertans who say they were harmed by the vaccines. One of the lawyers of the class action is Eva Chipiuk. She says this is a follow-up from the original lawsuit that was launched on behalf of Carrie Sakamoto of Lethbridge, who says she received injuries due to the vaccine.
This has a lot to do with the information that was presented by the various government officials and public health agencies, both federally and provincially, encouraging Canadians to take the vaccine, claiming it's safe and effective, and whether or not that vitiates informed consent. I do hope that not only is there financial compensation, but a recognition of, number one, what information should be going out to people publicly and what responsibilities are attached to those kind of public outcries. And then two, when people are injured, let's be kind, let's be responsible, and we haven't seen that.
An Alberta town councillor facing charges related to the 2022 Coutts border blockade has resigned. Marco Van Hugenbos made the announcement during a council meeting in Fort Macleod back in February. He says he's facing legal and personal challenges that may indirectly cast the town in a negative light.
I was never there for my objectives, my goals. I was there for the betterment of the community. Obviously, I had a view on issues and a position on issues, but I was always there with the mindset of what is right for my community and to do right by my community. And with essentially me going through the courts in the next couple months, if as a councillor would drag the town of Fort Macleod through the courts as well, and that would have a negative impact on the community.
Van Hugenbos is set to go to trial for a mischief charge in April related to the border blockade that protested the COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates. Alberta's 7-month pause on wind and solar development ended last month, but some in the renewable energy sector are concerned about the growing trend of politicizing energy, saying the Alberta government singled out the renewable energy sector by temporarily shutting down development to formulate new rules. Green Game Power says the company is holding off on future projects in the province until it can be certain renewable energy will be treated fairly. Government officials have said the moratorium was put in place to study renewables' impact on our agriculture sector.
To support the agriculture first approach, we will begin taking steps to make sure that the value and importance of agricultural land is taken into account when developing new renewable projects.
The Special Olympics Canada Winter Games came to a close in Calgary last weekend. To mark the occasion of the closing ceremonies, the Calgary Tower Flame was lit up from 7 till 8 p.m. Saturday night. The Games, which began February 27th, brought together over 1,250 participating Social Olympic athletes, coaches, and support staff from across Canada to compete in 8 different sports and drew more than 2,500 spectators. It's the first time the Olympic Games have been held in Calgary since 1988. Well, coming up, a strong reaction to the provincial government budget 2024. That's next. Alberta's UCP government is demanding the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour step down. Party officials say Gil McGowan, who is seeking the NDP leadership, should, quote, not use union dues as a slush fund for political ambitions. UCP MLA Shane Getson says Alberta's workers deserve a president focused on them and not on political games. McGowan plans on seeking the leadership to replace Rachel Notley in June. That would be 5 candidates who have put their names forward so far, the others being Calgary MLA Kathleen Ganley, Edmonton MLAs Sarah Hoffman and Raki Pancholi, and first-time MLA Jody Calahoo Stonehouse. Well, last week saw Alberta's 2024 budget with total expenses up 4% as the province expects to spend just over $73 billion in 2024 to 25. That's an increase of more than $3 billion since last February's projection. Spending, however, will fall short of matching the province's population growth and inflation rate of 7.4% in 2023 to 24. Alberta's debt is forecast to be around $95 billion in the upcoming fiscal year. With this new budget, just over $26 billion will be going towards health care. The province is also doubling its $1.5 billion contingency fund for natural disasters and emergencies, $151 million of that over the next few years toward wildlife preparedness. As for education, more than $9 billion has been set aside for students kindergarten through grade 12, including $1.5 billion to support vulnerable students. There is also $842 million in new funding to cover enrollment growth over the next few years, a move that was applauded by the Lethbridge School Division. And although some are saying that they are encouraged to see the budget addressing enrollment growth by putting more teachers in classrooms, Alberta Teachers Association President Jason Schilling says this budget doesn't go far enough. In a statement, the Alberta Teachers Association says they set out a 3-part test to judge this budget, and it appears to have failed on all 3 parts. Not only does Schilling say the budget doesn't fully address enrollment, he points out it also does little to address inflation and does nothing to repair years of underfunding. According to the ATA, Alberta schools are the least funded in Canada. Schilling also points out that the public schools will see a 4.4% increase compared to private schools, which will see a 13.5% increase. He summed it up by saying, quote, last year we saw what a pre-election budget looks like. Now we see what a post-election budget looks like. And it turns out he isn't the only one unimpressed by this budget. NDP finance critic Shannon Phillips did not mince words, saying not only will this budget affect education, but it's going to hit healthcare workers the most.
Well, I think the healthcare system is doomed with this budget. Already we are seeing so many closures of emergency departments. We're seeing limited hours throughout the rural areas in particular. You're seeing entire communities that have to drive 2 and 3 hours in order to have a baby or have simple procedures done. You have 60% of our family doctors who are looking at leaving their practice, and that was before this budget came out. And in our hospitals, it's worse. There is a 1% increase projected for our hospital budget. So if you think that everything's fine in the hospitals now, which it is not, just wait for it to get worse.
We also spoke with the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees President Guy Smith, who says this could have been a good news budget, but it's not. He says that in a $6.4 billion surplus, the province should have invested in Alberta's neglected public services and crumbling infrastructure, but it didn't. Instead, he says now Albertans will wait longer for wildfire response times, court services, educational support, critical health, and social services.
Whether it's in government services, healthcare, post-secondary, our members are kind of stretched to the limit, and they're proud of the work they do and the services they provide to Albertans. It's becoming more and more difficult, and as we're seeing, the population of Alberta is growing, the demand on services is growing, yet there's not the requisite investment in those services.
Smith also says it's a collective bargaining year for more than 82,000 AUPE members, most of whom work for the Government of Alberta and Alberta Health Services. And he says these workers plan to fight for better working conditions, whether the government budgets for it or not. And Lethbridge Mayor Blaine Higgin released a statement regarding the Alberta budget. In it, he says, quote, one highlight was the $43 million announced for the University of Lethbridge's Rural Medical Teaching School. It is a great initiative to train and retain doctors in Southern Alberta. We look forward to working with the provincial government in the coming weeks and months to learn more about what this budget means specifically for Lethbridge, end quote. And speaking of training doctors, after the break, we speak with a Canadian physician who says he had to leave the country in order to get trained. That's coming up after the break. A recent survey by St. George's University found that more than 650,000 Albertans need a family physician. The same study also found that more than 90% of doctors are concerned about the financial viability of their practices. Another 61% are thinking of leaving the Alberta healthcare system altogether. One Alberta doctor says a solution to address our province's doctor shortage may be bringing in internationally trained medical graduates, many of whom are Canadian citizens. Dr. Omar Kadri is a doctor who received his medical education overseas. He's a Canadian who studied medicine at St. George's University in Grenada and was trained in the U.S. He joined BCN's Hal Roberts from Leduc, Alberta, where he works as a family physician.
Dr. Kadri, why didn't you just apply to a Canadian university to receive your medical training?
Like many Canadians, I tried to get into medical school in Canada. It was very difficult, but the passion to pursue medicine was too strong. So even I tried to work here in other professions, but the passion was too strong. So I ended up looking some schools abroad, found the school in Grenada, went there, did a lot of my training on the island and then my clinical training in the States, and then matched back to Canada and did my residency back in Calgary and now working here, which is back, dream to be back in Edmonton or Leduc and working now.
So do you think that the key in addressing the doctor shortage across the country is maybe having provincial governments looking at Canadians who receive their medical education and training abroad?
Absolutely. That is, I think, one great solution there. Like at my school, there was at least 200 to 300 Canadians that were there. And many of us tried to match back into Canada. Of my class that had 800 to 900 residents that matched into their specialties, only about I think at the time 12 of us made it back into Canada, or in the teens maybe at most. And there was 300 of us that would have loved to come back and work into Canada.
Alberta's two discount airlines are in trouble, leaving Canadians with not a lot of competitive choices for airfare. But are Ottawa's policies partially to blame for Lynx Air and Flair Airlines' troubles? Both are on the hook for unpaid GST totaling a whopping $92 million. Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilly breaks it down with Hal Roberts. Take a look.
Now, Brian, you recently wrote that it was incompetence by the Trudeau government which led to the downfall of a couple of high-flying Alberta-based companies, Calgary-based Lynx Air and Edmonton-based Flair Airlines. Can you explain?
Well, so there's two things, two very separate issues. One, the policies that Canada has had under successive governments, these are not new policies by the Trudeau Liberals, although they've increased the fees on some things. The policies in this country are very different than other countries. And so we look and we say, why can't we have an EasyJet or a Wizz Air or a Ryanair or Southwest? Why can't we have these discount airlines that they have in the rest of the Western world? And the reason is we use a user pay model for our airports. Other countries look at airports as key infrastructure and the government pays for them. We have the air traveler pay for them. But beyond that, this is where the government comes in. They collect rents on the airports. The federal government used to run the airports. They made them so-called not-for-profits with local airport authorities, but they took almost $500 million in rent last year out of these airports. Well, that gets passed on to you. Our jet fuel tax is 158% higher than the Americans. Theirs is 1.5 cents per liter. Ours is 4 cents. And then on top of the jet fuel excise tax, we tax that with the carbon tax and then tax both of those taxes with the GST. The security charges are through the roof compared to the Americans, even though they're very similar. Ours cost a lot more. We don't get better service, trust me. So all of these costs add up, and it makes it difficult to offer that $99 flight from Toronto to Calgary or Calgary to Toronto that would get us going back and forth more. One airline executive from a different competing airline said that on a Toronto to Calgary route, before you pay for an hour of labor, an ounce of fuel, or even a stick of steel to build the plane, you've got $160 in fixed cost for that one-way ticket. That's why we can't have these discount airlines. So there's that. Then on the other side, there's an issue with both airlines not having paid GST on the planes they imported to the tune of $92 million before the federal government came calling. So that both sides show on the one side, a lack of interest in helping a struggling airline sector and helping Canadians get affordable travel. And on the other side, utter incompetence.
The federal government is open to potentially changing the Emergencies Act. The public safety minister could be looking at 22 recommendations. We dive into that after the break. Well, we learned this week the federal government is open to potentially changing the Emergencies Act. Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc says Ottawa will consider several recommendations from Justice Rouleau's report, which came out last year. To talk about this in more detail is Lethbridge MP and Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage, Rachel Thomas, who joined Hal Roberts.
So the Emergencies Act, of course, was incited by the Prime Minister, and it was his response to what was known as the trucker convoy in Ottawa. And of course, we had truckers from all across the country fill the streets there in the nation's capital. And the reason they did so is because they were against vaccine mandates was one of the big things that they were against. But more importantly, they were against the Prime Minister's divisive politics. He was certainly trying to, stigmatize and divide us as Canadians. And so they were protesting that, and they had every right to do so. The Prime Minister, in a rage of glory, decided that he was going to enact the Emergencies Act. What has been determined now from the federal courts is actually that he moved that act unnecessarily. Now, of course, Trudeau can't accept that ruling, and so he's taking it to be challenged. But nevertheless, that ruling has been made. And so it doesn't surprise me that Minister Dominic LeBlanc then is saying they need more time. They're going to need more time probably for a long time to actually make any changes or implement any of the 56 recommendations. To answer your question directly, Hal, look, the number one recommendation out of that report that should be enacted today, it should not take any further consideration, is he said, point blank, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms needs to be upheld. That's a no-brainer. Yeah, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms needed to be upheld from day one and never should have been violated. And so I would start there, and then I would continue implementing a number of his other recommendations.
Rachel, another class action lawsuit has been launched against both the federal and provincial governments on behalf of Albertans who were vaccine injured or who lost their jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what are your thoughts when you hear about some civil lawsuits such as this?
Yeah, I think first my heart breaks for those that did suffer a vaccine injury. I've certainly sat in my office with a few of these folks who have suffered because of the vaccine that they took, and it's been proven through medical assessments and documentation. And then, they've applied for assistance from a federal program that was set up in order to respond. And it's been hurdle after hurdle, unfortunately. There's been so many gatekeepers in the way of receiving the payout that is due to them, the medications that they should be given, the therapies that they should have access to. And so I'm trying to help these folks be able to access those things that they rightly deserve. So it doesn't surprise me that this case has come forward. I think people have suffered a tremendous amount, and they have every right to bring a civil case like this to the courts. And I look forward to watching the process unfold.
Now let's talk about that carbon tax for just a moment here, Rachel. It's going up April 1st by around 23%. That'll make life so much harder for so many of us who use natural gas to heat our homes and filling up our vehicles. Now, we do receive rebates, but oftentimes the rebates are simply not enough. Now, your leader, Pierre Poilievre, keeps blasting the Prime Minister, saying, like you said, he needs to axe the tax, but why isn't the message getting through? Cannot Trudeau see how so many Canadians are struggling right now?
Unfortunately, Hal, I think the message is getting through in the sense that the Prime Minister knows Canadians don't like the carbon tax. It's why he paid costly consultants to help him do a rebrand. He knows Canadians hate it. And so he tried to come up with some new spiffy name in hopes that he could perhaps, get Canadians on side. The fact of the matter is they're not. Canadians are paying through the roof when it comes to the carbon tax, whether it's on gas or groceries or home heating, and they're sick of it. Quite frankly, they can't afford it. Month over month, we saw 2 million people on average visit food banks across this country during 2023. In 2024, we're expecting upwards of 3 million people as a monthly average to go to food banks. I mean, this is not the Canada we know. This is supposed to be a place of opportunity and being able to further oneself. And instead, due to Trudeau's punitive policies, people are 2 steps back rather than 2 steps ahead. That's not okay.
Well, 'tis the season for the cold and flu. Have you been hit with it yet? I know I have. So we know we're supposed to take supplements to boost our immunity, right? But what kinds of vitamins are best? Well, up next, we hear from naturopathic Dr. Clayton Cogonall on how to keep the flu and cold germs away. We'll be right back.